Welcome to the Tudor Dixon Podcast. Well, we are almost starting a new year, and we thought, what better way to start the new year with something really motivational. And I saw this story about a guy who walked the entire world. And that sounds insane. I'm like, how long does that take? Because, I'm used to like walking around the block. And apparently it takes a really long time. So I'm going to have Tom come in and tell you his name is Tom Turcich. He is an amazing guy, a motivational speaker, a photographer, but honestly, the guy walked around the world. How much cooler does that get? Tom, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have you. I was reading your story, and your part of your story is that you had this fear of death growing up and you lost a friend at 16. And I actually also lost a friend at 16, a terrible car accident. And I kind of feel like I went through those same thoughts of like, what does this mean? How do I handle this? Why was it this person and not me? And as a kid, I think those are all really hard thoughts to handle. I did not go with, I'm going to walk around the world. And I'm fascinated by the fact that that is what you did, because I feel like in that moment, knowing that kind of pain, there are thoughts like, how can I make an impact? How can I seek what I'm looking for and find myself? So tell us a little bit about that part of your journey.
Yeah, well, like you, I had a friend who died. I was 17, she was 16, Anne Marie, and we were very close since childhood. We grew up a block apart, walked to elementary school together, walked to high school together, in the same group of friends. And when she died, like you said, especially at that age, it's really impactful. And I think all these questions of death and how to live, they kind of pop into your head when you're younger, but aren't fully resolvable, come flooding back. And so for me, when I thought about, I have this very limited amount of time here, and my time is not guaranteed. I thought, okay, what do I want out of this one shot that I have in life? And I reflected on it for about 6 months. And it wasn't something I took lightly. I was really just left in this fog and I was trying to find a way out of it. I really reflected, okay, I got one shot at this. What do I want? Ultimately, I came to the answer that I wanted to travel. I wanted to be forced into adventure because I was timid and I was introverted and I wanted to grow out of that. And I wanted to understand the world. And so then when I started looking for ways to travel, initially I was looking at travel blogs of Euro railing. And I thought, okay, this summer I'm going to go with my cousin over to Europe and we're going to get a Euro pass and we're going to bounce around Europe and do all that. And I still every night was spending hours and hours on these travel blogs. I was just obsessed with it and trying to find a way to, maximize it. And eventually I discovered these two guys, Steve Newman and Carl Bushby, who had walked around the world. And as soon as I saw that, really right away, I knew that fulfilled everything I wanted out of life. It would be this really slow form of travel that would be an adventure. Every day, I would understand the world in a better way than almost any other manner I could imagine. And I would really get a sense of what humanity was like outside of just the highlights, outside of just Paris and Machu Picchu or Angkor Wat, all the places you normally travel. And then on top of that, I didn't have any money, so it was an affordable way to go too.
I mean, I guess affordable, but I find it fascinating because I think about your fears and trying to overcome your fears. I mean, you are really putting yourself into one of the most dangerous situations you can possibly put yourself into. You're all alone. You went with your dog. So it's you and the dog. And a lot of the time you're camping.
Yeah, I think the way I resolve that, there's a certain amount of just danger or risk that you have to accept when you are pursuing, I think, any dream in general. And, any dream, you're going to fail a lot. My dream in walking around the world, the failure could have been, getting kidnapped or murdered or whatever else, at its worst. Especially when I began, I was very naive and I really didn't know quite how to handle myself. And I learned as the years went on, I became better at navigating these different cultures and different places. But in the beginning, I was very naive. I grew up in a safe suburb in New Jersey, didn't have any exposure to any of that. But all that being said, the thing that Anne-Marie taught me when I was 17 was that, look, nothing's guaranteed to begin with. And so I may as well live the life that I want to live rather than this passive life where things just sort of happen to me and the time passes anyway and nothing is guaranteed anyway. So I may as well, fail, but in the direction of my dreams.
It's so interesting because I think about this and I think, okay, you were so young, and you say it in some of your stories. You say, I mean, you think that naivete kind of helped you because you didn't have as much fear because you didn't know what to fear. And I think about myself at 17. Of course, I wouldn't know what to fear going around the world. I just didn't know that much, But you stepped into it, and potentially that saved your life, being naive, which seems odd, but maybe that is what happened. But this was 7 years, a 7-year walk, 28,000 miles, 6 continents that you went through for 7 years and sometimes you write that you sometimes came to a city that was dangerous and you decided you would get a room for the night so that you could protect yourself. But you ran into some situations where they could have gone the wrong way. There was one time when you were actually detained, right?
Yeah, that was years in. That was in Turkey and just above the Syrian border. But I would say, through all this, there's, especially when you're beginning to walk and you're naive and Central America, which is just statistically a little bit more dangerous because it's a narrow strip of land. There's a lot of movement of illicit goods and people looking for a better life, and so it's just a little bit more dangerous in Central America. I was glad I was naive then, because I think if I did that years later, I would have been much more stressed out. But in the beginning, I was able to just go and kind of be on fire with the idea of walking around the world and kind of ignore everything around me. But as the years went on, one of the facts of humanity that was worn into me really, really deeply was that people are good everywhere. There are, of course, bad actors, and there's corruption, and there's people who will want to take advantage of you. There's that, but that I think is a pretty minor thing compared to the day to day that I lived. Majority of the time, it's people giving me water and giving me food and asking if I need help. Like, the vast majority of humanity is just people trying to make some money and hang out with their family. And as the years went on and you do that for 5, 6, 7 years, traveling kind of gets boring, strangely, because you realize, oh, it is the same everywhere and people are the same everywhere. The surface level things change, but really when it comes down to it, it's just people that, want to hang out with their friends and family.
Wow. So do you have like the coolest parents in the world or what? Because if I go to my parents at 17 and I'm like, see, I'll be back in 7 years, I'm going to go walk around the world. They're not like, yeah, that's awesome. Go do it.
My mom was, I would say, not on board is maybe a little harsh, but she knew how naive and dumb I was. And my dad lived under a tarp in Hawaii for 4 years when he was out of high school, and he spearfished for food, and he worked at a sugar plantation for money. So for him, it was much more like, oh yeah, go do it. This is what you're supposed to do. Go have an adventure. So he was always on board. And I think it took about a year for my mom until she was like, okay, he knows what he's doing now.
Wow. So this runs in the family, obviously, but honestly, going around the world, I mean, I think there's only 10 people, correct?
Yeah, I'm the 10th person, and my dog Savannah is the first dog to ever walk around the world.
Wow. That is incredible. So tell us I mean, I know you say that everybody, or it started to get boring because it like those innate wants. And I find that interesting with the culture that we're in right now, is that really you go to work to feed your family, to spend time with your family, and you were away from your family for 7 years. So even in one of the writings you put that there were a lot of goodbyes. It was a constant, every season was a season of goodbye because you meet people and you leave. That has to be hard. But what were some of the most fascinating things you learned from people? Because there have to be some differences that you saw or some experiences that just stand out.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, like you said, the walk was just constant change. And in the beginning of my book, my little tribute is to Savannah, and it says, Savannah, my only constant. because it really felt like every day you're dealing with a new place, a new person, new people, new food, new terrain. And when I look back on it, like towards the end of the walk, I say the way I would think about it was like those 7 years felt like 20 years, just because there's so much growth, there was so much change always. And it's a really beautiful thing. And the book, The World Walk, is really the story of my growth. But by the end, it was exhausting. And I was so ready for the walk to be over and to have just a house and to have a bed and to have coffee in the morning and to have a shelter to be out of the elements, not to be walking through the rain every day or the sun or the snow. But the thing that the walk taught me a few big things. And I think also, the walk is unique in how slow it is and how you're able to really feel the world in a way that you normally can, even if you're biking or driving through a place. And I think one of the primary lessons that I learned was just how small people are. Sort of a difficult concept to convey, but I would meet these people all over the world, whether it's in the desert of Peru or in the jungles of Costa Rica or in, the mountains of Kyrgyzstan. And what you realize is that there are people who are much smarter than you, much more generous than you, much more driven than you are. And yet everyone, including them and yourself, are determined by the limitations of whatever is around them, the geography, the culture. And you see yourself in all these different places, and it could have just as easily been you born in the deserts of Peru selling gasoline to passing trucks. And it could have been you born, as a shepherd in Kyrgyzstan. And those would have been my limitations. But I was born in America in a very wealthy state, and I have an American passport. And I was lucky to get a good paying job out of college. And I was the one passing through their country rather than the other way around because of, my circumstances. And so I think, it's one of these things that I talk about in my motivational speaking. One of the ideas that I talk about is to kind of let yourself off the hook in a little bit, set a big goal, but in the day to day, sort of relax. I think people put so much pressure on themselves to be exceptional and to be better than everyone else and to find some path that differentiates them. There's a lot of people in the world, and they're just people, and you're just a person too. And so I think it really takes a lot of pressure off when you realize not you control much less of your life than you probably think you do.
So, do you think that that is an issue in the United States, that there's so much pressure that people are constantly striving to make a big mark? And you really are. I mean, I oftentimes think as I drive to work, every house I drive by is another story, another family, a different crisis, different joys, all the things that go on in my life go on in their life in a different way. Is it time to step back and focus on the moments rather than the years in the future?
Yeah, I do think it's an issue, and maybe it's an American exceptionalism thing or
Mm.
a rugged individualism thing that you think if you aren't as successful as you think you should be, that you're a failure. And I think that's just doing a disservice to yourself and probably to your family. And it puts these expectations that are really unrealistic on yourself and probably unattainable. I think you'll always be moving the bar in that way. But when you understand that you're just a human, the world is big, you're very small, to achieve your dreams, things take a long time. It takes a long time. It doesn't happen overnight. And when you realize all those things, you kind of are able to take the pressure off yourself and in a certain way do the action regardless of whatever emotions are going on inside. This is one of the things that Savannah, my dog, really drove home when we were walking. We were walking together 8 hours a day, every day, side by side. And so I remember having this thought looking down at her in Peru where I was feeling pretty sick that day. And I'm thinking, man, I'm sure she has stomach aches and muscle pains. I'm sure there are days she wants nothing more than to just lay in bed. And yet every day she walks with her tail held high, doesn't complain. And so that taught me in a certain way to just do the thing, walk the 24 miles, regardless of how I'm feeling. And I think there's a similar thing in life, in knowing that you are just another person, where just do the act, do the best you can, and then everything else, just relax.
So
It's
it was
life.
24 miles every day that you walked?
Yeah, 24 miles every day, pretty much. Yeah. More or less. Sometimes we do 30 if we're in, the desert. Other days in winter in Wyoming or in Kansas, it would be like 18 and they'd be miserable.
How much time did you have to prepare for all of the different environments you would be in, the weather you would face? How did you know?
Well, luckily, when you're walking, it's very slow changes. And so I usually had time to adjust to a new place or new climate. Say in one of the more dramatic changes was in the US when I was the final section, when I walked from Seattle to New Jersey. And I walked the Great Plains, well, Wyoming down to the Great Plains and across the Great Plains in winter. And I was picking up winter gear kind of gradually as I went. I was like, oh man, I need better boots. Okay, I need, another sleeping bag for Savannah. I need whatever else. And so you kind of pick it up along the way. And that's usually how it went, where I could adjust gradually. It wasn't like I was just being dropped into a place.
That is wild. So, I mean, are there any individual stories? Like you got really sick. I mean, you went through the pandemic. How did that happen? What was it like to go through a pandemic when, I mean, we were all in the comfort of our own home and it was like, okay, we can stay here. We can stay safe. We won't go anywhere. Where were you? How did that go down?
So I got stuck in Azerbaijan for 6 months during the pandemic, which it was actually a great place to be stuck, but it was a strange experience.
I don't even know that place. Like that's a place I don't even know.
Yeah, yeah, it's in the Caucasus, so it's next to Georgia, below Russia, above Turkey, next to Armenia, um, along the Caspian Sea, and it is wealthy on oil and gas. And anyway, so I was thinking, okay, it would have been, I guess, my 5th year of walking then, and this was early 2020, and I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to make this long sprint across Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, back into Kazakhstan, across Mongolia, all the way up to the capital of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. And I thought, all right, I'm going to start this sprint. It's going to be a really difficult year, but I'm going to get there before winter sets in. And I get into Azerbaijan, and I'm there for about a week. And kind of one by one, it's like Georgia's closed, Russia's closed, Armenia's closed. And next thing I know, every country around Azerbaijan was closed because of COVID.
How were you getting this news? Like, did you have a way of getting news?
Yeah. And there's in today's world, I was probably the first world walker where the internet is pretty prevalent. So for the most part, I had good internet, or internet at least. But then I was also talking to people. Like when I found out the capital of Azerbaijan was closed, it was just from a guy in the mountains that was telling me that, Baki, it's called Baku, but he said Baki. So Baki was closed. And they let me in anyway because I was a tourist, basically. But yeah, I got stuck in Azerbaijan for 6 months because everything was closed and I couldn't find a flight out that would take Savannah. And then when Turkey reopened, or when I was able to get a flight out, I went back to Turkey, which I had already walked across because the other countries on my route in the future were closed. I walked around Turkey for a while until some countries started reopening, and then I flew into those countries and walked them when I could. But COVID didn't let me get into Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Australia, 3 countries on my original route. But yeah, it was a strange year. It was a strange year of backtracking and slowing down. And it also kind of fed that desire to be in one place, like you were asking about earlier, where when I stopped in Azerbaijan for 6 months, it's like, man, it's kind of nice to, not be getting blasted by the wind and the sun every day. I would like to do this more. And so that started giving me the dreams of, ending the walk one day.
I mean, 7 years. Were you ever at the point where you were like, I'm not going to do it? Did you ever think about going home or turning back?
Not really. I I had the bacterial infection after South America that really knocked me out for a while.
And you had to go
And
back to the US for that, right?
correct, yeah,
Okay.
I dropped like 45 pounds. I was down to 122 pounds at my lowest.
Gosh, you don't look like you could
Y-
drop that much
no,
weight.
I'm very skinny already. And so it was bad. Eventually knocked it out, and I started my walk again in Europe, and I had lived with this pain from it for like months. And when I was walking in Europe, which should have been probably the easiest walking on my journey because of the bike routes and how developed it is and how peaceful it is, instead it was probably the most miserable, just because I lived with all this pain, and my normal optimism was turned to pessimism. And when you're walking, you have to be really good company to yourself. It's just you and you out there all the time. And I was not good company to myself. And so there were times then when I was thinking, man, it'd be really nice to be back at home, Sunday dinner with the grandparents, getting a drink with my friends, waking up in a bed every day, not pushing through the rain. But when I really played those things out, it came back to what I valued, and Anne Marie dying at 17. And again, my values, what I wanted out of life were the same. Even if the outcome was, me being temporarily miserable or me dying, the values that I really reflected on when I was 17, wanted to travel, wanted to be forced into adventure, wanted to understand the world, and then the world walk, which fulfilled all of those. That was still what I wanted, even when I was really sick. And so when I played out in my head, all right, let's go back, that wouldn't be nearly as fulfilling as, sitting in this forest wherever I was, eating pasta for the 500th time and,
Well, I mean,
just
and
sitting by myself.
once you're that far into it, did you go home any other time? Was it just that one time, or were there trips back?
So I went home after South America to get Savannah's paperwork to get her into Europe. And then I started Europe, got sick, came back again. And then I came back for like 3 days in the middle of COVID in 2021 to get the vaccine so I could continue into Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. So yeah, I went back 3 times.
Wow, just 3 times in 7 years.
Yeah.
Did you communicate a lot though with family and
Yeah. It was nice because like, I was pretty connected to the internet. There's stretches in Mexico or Peru and Chile or in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan where there was no internet. But when I got to a town and got to a hotel, there was almost always Wi-Fi. Not always, but most of the time. And I could like FaceTime my parents or FaceTime a friend or something. So it was this strange kind of dichotomy of being connected, but also then, for the most part, being very removed from everyone. I would talk to my best friend a lot, and he always marveled at he was in Manhattan. He's working at this ad agency, and he's like, "I'm in Manhattan, walking down, Fifth Avenue right now, and you are in the mountains of Colombia." It's like, how different could our lives be? And yet, we're talking it out on the phone.
what were the biggest differences in culture? Like where did you think it was the biggest change from home?
Uzbekistan, it is a country that has been closed for a really long time. They, moved. The Soviet Union fell in '91, and then they basically had a dictatorship, a very closed off dictatorship until I guess like 6 years ago now. And when I was there, it was only a few years removed from this dictator's death, and they were so closed off that and so insular that the food was very homogenous, which isn't a bad thing. It was great food, great plav, these rice dishes and with lamb. But there was like no advertisements. I would go through these towns and they had never met a tourist. I mean, frequently. I was the first foreigner they ever met.
Wow.
And I had this strange experience a lot when I would get to these towns where, because there's no advertisements and because there's no one kind of passing through these towns that isn't from the town, I'd be looking around. It's like, I know there's, a store here. I know there's a restaurant here. There's too many people, but I don't see anything. It looks like just houses. And then I would ask, hey, is there a restaurant around? And they'd point over to this house, and I'd go over there. I wouldn't see any sign. And then I'd go back and go, I don't see any restaurant. And then they'd walk me over, open the door, and there's 50 people inside this person's
Yeah.
house. And just, you don't need the advertisement when everyone knows it's the restaurant.
That's so funny. But how did you communicate? They didn't speak English.
Well, I had like downloaded Uzbek on Google Translate, and so I could, type it in that way.
So
Or I
you must
also
have
had a
like
little bit
had
of
to like
Russian by then.
stop in random places to charge.
Yeah. At a hotel, or if I was at a restaurant, I would always just ask to plug in my things, and you make that work. So Uzbekistan was very different for sure, just because how insular it is. Algeria was very different for me. It's a really devout country, and I had a police escort the entire time I was there. So for 45 days, I had a police escort with
Oh,
me,
wow. How did they
and
know you were there?
I landed. It's a very difficult country to get into in the first place. You need a letter of recommendation from someone in Algeria, and luckily, my ex-boss was Algerian, and his mother still lived in Algeria, and so she wrote me this letter of invitation. So I was able to get this visa. I took a ferry from Spain down to Mosaganem, this town on the Algerian coast. And basically, as soon as I saw the American passport and the visa, they're like, you got to hold on a second. We got to just make sure you get the hotel safe. And then I got to the hotel and they're like, well, what are your plans? So, I'm planning on walking across the country. And says, well, we got to make sure you do this safely. And so then I kind of became the responsibility of every municipality. So about 3 times a day, my police escort would change. And that was really strange because I was used to having, unlimited freedom and stopping
Yeah.
whenever I felt like and letting my mind wander however it wanted to. And I went from that to having sometimes like 10 guys, 10 policemen like watching me all the time, and all very nice, all always very nice and kind. But it was just very jarring to have that for 45 days.
Wow. So, okay. So you come back home. Before you came home, you met a couple and then you became friends with them. Explain what happened. How did the journey end? And you ended up with a love interest.
Yeah, I did. So I landed in Seattle after this was a little under 6.5 years of walking, and the plan walking across the country. And I stopped in this little town after crossing the Cascades National Forest. I stopped in this little town to write for a little bit, and I downloaded Tinder for like the first time. It was like the second time in my life, and I open it up and there's like 5 girls on there, and one of these girls is standing in a river, and she's got a bear gun in her, the like on her chest, and she's got, she's fly fishing. It's like, wow, this girl looks, amazing. She's a paramedic from Alaska. So we started messaging. She's in the town over doing family medicine rotation. She's in medical school, and she came over. We had this, first date, getting pizza, and just kind of hit it off. And her name's Bonnie. And you said your daughter, right, is Bonnie?
Yes, I
Yeah,
have a
daughter
Bonnie.
Bonnie. And then she kind of just followed me around. We hit it off in a way that, I met a lot of people on my travels. Met a lot of people, and Bonnie was, if not the best, one of the best people that I met. Really intelligent. We have very similar humor. Beautiful and driven. And then, she's from Alaska, so she, she can, ride horses, she can ski, or snowboard, she can do it all, fish, hunt, all that. So just a really interesting person. And we hit it off, and she kind of followed me around. We had this thing where it was Labor Day weekend when we met. And so I stopped for a few days, and then I was like, oh man, I don't want to leave. And we said this really dramatic goodbye. And then I realized I'm only walking 20 miles, and she can just come and pick me up and we can hang out again, at the
That's
end
so
of the day.
funny.
And so we did that for a few times. And then gradually I got out of range, and she visited me in Colorado and Pennsylvania. And now we're engaged 3 years later, over 3 years later, and life is good.
Wow. Congratulations. That is so exciting. So you are now home. You've written a book. It's called The World Walk. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the World Walk is my memoir. It's the story of my growth, really, going from that very naive suburbanite who doesn't know anything about the world, who doesn't know how to defend himself, who doesn't know how to navigate a new culture, and into a world traveler, someone who understands the world in a way that is rare and unique, just from walking for 7 years. And so it's really about the journey of my growth, and then of course all these different adventures. And it's getting great reviews. People are loving it, and I'm
So
very
where
proud
can
of
you
it.
get it?
What's that?
Where can you get it?
Yeah, you can get it anywhere. Barnes and Noble, probably your local bookstore. It's published by Skyhorse, so distributed by Simon and Schuster. So it should be everywhere. Amazon. However you want to get it. It should be coming out in audiobook pretty soon. Maybe by the end of the month. Maybe by the time this is out, it'll be out as well. So yeah, it's a great read. It's a great holiday, gift, and a quick read. I would say I made it as enjoyable and chewable as possible.
Do you ever wake up and go, where am I? And wish you were back out camping and walking around the world?
Occasionally, but then, I get my hot shower and I have my hot
Yeah.
coffee and this isn't so bad.
Right. So before I let you go, what's the future? Do you do any more traveling? Do you guys do this together?
Yeah, well, I mean, Bonnie and I will definitely travel, and we did a bunch of trips this year. I think in the future, right now, I'm doing this motivational speaking for sales teams and leadership, and it's strange because I don't think I ever would have enjoyed it before doing this walk, but now having walked, I have advice that I think makes people's lives better and more enjoyable, and I'm really enjoying actually doing this public speaking and kind of sharing my thoughts on the world and how to live a better, happier, more effective life. And
So what
so
do you think is the most valuable piece of advice you've shared?
I think the most valuable piece of advice is to be more reckless.
Mm.
It's kind of it's the idea that you're going to fail no matter what. And so you may as well fail in the
Fail
direction that you
big.
want to. Fail big, fail big, yeah, basically that. Fail big and fail in the direction that you want to fail. And I think a lot of people end up being so afraid of failure that they get paralyzed and they don't do anything with their lives. But once you assume failure is guaranteed, it liberates you in a lot of ways. And you can fail in a way that kind of feels good. At least I'm growing in the way I want to grow.
Well, because failure is how you grow. I mean, you really have never learned anything if you haven't failed. That's learning, right? So failing big means that you're also winning big.
That's exactly it. You're dead on.
That's awesome. Oh, Tom, I'm so glad I got to talk to you today. And for everybody out there, the book is The World Walk. Go out and get it. It's going to help you to fail big as well and be motivated to go out and do big things. And at the beginning of the year, we want to go out and do big things. So make sure you check it out. And it's Tom Turcich. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks so much, Tudor. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining the Tudor Dixon Podcast. For this episode and others, go to tudordixonpodcast.com or the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And join us next time. Have a blessed day.